Hello and welcome to the FPL Script. I'm your host JD with my co host Fran and a very special guest to kick off our series of timeless podcast episodes. He is the artist formerly known as FPL Meta. His lowest ever OR has been 28k in 4 seasons of FPL, placing him among the creme de la creme of managers. He is a dear friend and a collaborator for World Cup 2022 fantasy content. He conducts social experiments by convincing others to spunk their bench boost chips in Gameweek 1. He is Elevenify. Over to you, Fran.
Thank you, JD, and of course, welcome Elevenify to the pod. Today's first part series is going to be looking at the application of models within FPL. But I feel like if we take a step back and look at the word models, it has been a word that, in my opinion, has caused a little bit of fear within the community, particularly for those who might not necessarily play with models as part of their approach and process to FPL. So, my first question to Elevenify would be, what is a model?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for inviting me on. So, when we talk about what is a model, I think it's probably helpful first to take a small step back and kind of start from a base point of thinking about, okay, what is it we're even trying to do with a model? Why would we use such a thing in the first place? What's the purpose? Which is basically we're trying to predict certain aspects of the future. And I think this is probably a helpful thing to think about first because it lets us recognize that this activity is not model specific, so to speak. So actually virtually every decision we make each day, whether it be small decisions like driving your car or bigger life decisions like choosing a job, these are all us making predictions of the future in a way that we're not having any kind of sophisticated model output. We're just essentially using a low resolution mental model every day on a personal level. And for me, at least, I just think about the kind of models we use in FPL as more sophisticated, high resolution versions of what we already do without them. So, for me at least, this is helpful because, as you said, the discussion about models can sometimes get a little bit messy, and it's quite easy to overcomplicate what a model actually is. Yes, the actual technical makeup of the model and the processes can be complicated. So, examples might be that a bookie's odds using bookie's percentages might be relatively simple. Then I'd say the kind of machine learning model that Shaden does is more complex. And then maybe something like what FPL Review does is the most complex. But all of these models, again, I think of them on the same kind of sliding scale that, in essence, they're very simple. They're looking at percentages. That's all they are. So keeping this in mind, I think, can let people be more at ease with the idea that we can express FPL predictions in numerical form. When you take the approach of remembering it's basically all percentages and likelihoods, then, comes back to what I was saying earlier, that even someone who might have never looked at model outputs are sort of doing the same thing in their head already. So probably what I would say is that I think probably everyone listening that has at some point looked at anytime scoring or clean sheet odds has thought maybe, that's high or that's low. They're doing essentially the same thing. And if you take that even further, literally anyone could turn their mental model into an incredibly crude kind of output model with EV. All you have to do is, choose a player, grab the FPL scoring rules, and then go through what you think the percentage likelihood of each of those things is for happening for that player. You put all that together and you actually have a number. You have EV. I think really models in their core essence aren't anything more than that. So for me at least, I think of them on a scale in that sense. And that's why I think it's quite hard to sort of say you might be anti-model or something like that, because at least for me, everyone is using some kind of model.
Yeah, nowadays I think it's it's more appropriate to say X points instead of EV, but that is a succinct explanation of what a model is. So with the stuff that you and I did during the World Cup, right, with the World Cup fantasy, we often talked about how a model is simply a decision supporting tool, right? And I think you were very clear on kind of making sure that everyone knew this, that this is not going to make a decision for you, that the decision is still up to you, which is ultimately an ensemble model, if you will, in that it's your decision making combined with some data that we provide you. So, do you think that our discretion and our biases inherently, even if you use FPL review, for example, make it a different model anyway to purely using FPL review?
Oh, that's kind of a good question. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, for me at least, I've always strongly had the framework that you've mentioned just there, which is that they are decision support tools. And I think probably within the so-called quote unquote analytics crowd, if that kind of thing even exists, and this idea that there's people who might follow things a bit blindly, like robots. I probably am actually one of the people who parts from EV much more freely than other people, and I'm probably more open to incorporating other elements into my decision than just the EV number than I think a lot of other people would be. So yeah, for me, I like you said when we did the World Cup thing, I think it's always really clear that people know these are decision support tools, and ultimately you can do with them what you will.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed your explanation of the percentages and the sliders because coming from a non-analytics background and actually using FPL Review this year, particularly the model, but also the solver, and changing, for example, the user parameters on the solver and also adjusting for xMins on a weekly basis, that has sort of felt like replicating this adjustment of the sliders for me. And so that resonates with me. However, if we just take a step back and think about, let's say, the pervading criticism of models within the community, which is that they're slow to adjust to things like managerial changes, tactical changes, or even something like, the mental state of a player. How do you think that that's actually tackled by models, or how do you think models adjust for that?
Yeah, so good question. And I agree. I think that's kind of one of the main criticisms I see that does pop up generally. This, if you had to summarize the criticism, it's this kind of models don't account for X attitude. And I think just within that criticism, there's certain things that are more valid and less valid. But I actually think mostly the answer to that, or my response to that kind of criticism, would come from yes, it's probably true that models either do not account at all, do not account enough, or account too slowly for a lot of these things that perhaps we would like to. But actually, I think a lot of these things that people generally say the models are not accounting for might not be that predictive in themselves. I see that quite a lot, or at least the predictive power that they have within the constraints of FPL as a game is rather minimal, particularly when we talk about things like tactical changes. For example, things like that become very vague, very grey, and even with them, the feedback loop is pretty unclear as well. And also, lastly, it depends on what kind of model and whose model you're working with as well. Because, for example, I think it depends how confident you are in the model, I guess. We've seen through the data and tests that Review has put out that his is pretty reliable. So you would expect his to pick up on those kind of changes and things. But again, for me, it comes back down to, okay, even if the model doesn't pick up on those things, I am skeptical of your power and my skill and ability as an individual to account for those things in a manner that is more predictive than the model would be. That's usually where I think the criticism might fall down. Even if it's valid in itself as a statement, it doesn't really necessarily hold on the follow through in terms of FPL performance.
So would you say that simply there is too much noise within outcome, specifically that whichever model you end up using, it's pretty hard to get like a model to mirror those results because there's more noise than signal anyway within like the parameters of football.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we'll probably get on to in depth when we talk about luck versus skill. But yeah, I think it's as we again, I think probably the helpful answer to that is again, let's come back round to percentages. So if we think about a model as an expression of percentages against the FPL scoring system, if you want to start accounting for some of these intangibles that we agree models might not quote unquote pick up on, certain things like a tactical change, a positional change, or even, we see a lot of people talking about things like just simply players being in a good emotional spot or being confident, stuff like this. We see this all the time. It's like, okay, even if these kind of things aren't picked up and you want them to be picked up, it's not even clear to me how you would go about doing that in a percentage sense, in a model or not. It becomes, as I said, that sort of loops back around to what I was just saying before, is like, I personally don't see how anyone can start to incorporate those things in any reliably predictive way that would lead to increased FPL performance.
Oh yeah, that actually makes sense. And also, while we are on the subject of us creating our model for World Cup, or I think you had your own data model for FPL as well as the Champions League fantasy game. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in general, I think between us, we have a lot of experience in terms of creating our own models. So, what do you think specifically is advantageous, even though probably yours might not be, or mine might not be as sophisticated as FPL reviews. What specifically do you think is there to gain by kind of designing your own framework for your model?
Yeah, yeah, brilliant question. Um, so the kind of this is a good to follow on from what we were just saying about criticisms of models. In that, actually, I think probably for me, one of the biggest criticisms that I would levy against other people's models and the use of models generally, if you force me to, even criticizing something like FPL review, is that it's difficult to use these things when you do not know the inputs, and that is why you might want to build your own model. So, fortunately, with FPL review, as I said, he's published loads of studies and stuff that shows the predictive performance of his model is really good. So it's very easy to trust it. But the reality is that if you're looking at other people's model outputs, you do not know what their inputs are. And again, I'm circling a background to like this kind of percentage idea. You don't know the inputs, so you don't know what has come together to make up that X points EV numerical output of other people's models. And that's quite difficult in a lot of ways, because you don't really know what you do and don't agree with other people's projections, and you can't really derive it from just seeing the numerical number itself, because obviously there's so many things that go into it. You might, for example, I think a good example of something I've seen over the years is, I think Son and Kane from Tottenham are a really good example, because we've seen their EV chop and change, but roughly be around the same kind of numbers over the years. And it's been quite interesting from a modeling analytics perspective. But if you see someone's model outputs of Son and Kane, you don't know some of the most important things that make up making that number. So for someone like Kane, what weighting is there on the penalties? And with someone like Son, what weighting have they given to something like finishing skill?
Yeah.
So, sometimes I've seen model outputs and it has maybe Son like 2 or 3 points above Kane. And I think, whoa, that's really lots. And perhaps I can assume and derive from that they've really highly weighted finishing skill. But I don't know. And that's why you might want to build your own model, because at the very least, even if it's not a very good model, you know the inputs, and hopefully you can adjust the inputs going forward. But that's probably the main criticism I'd have.
And one more follow-up corollary, if you will, which is that, do you think it is kind of helpful for yourself, like the person who builds the model, to kind of get into some kind of correlation study after the fact and try to understand if his model is actually improving, or if it has some correlation with anything? Like, for example, FPL Kiwi did a study of how you can model finishing ability by adding a certain constant to the number of goals and the xg, to kind of get a better idea of how good of a finisher a player is, and then you can incorporate that into your player model. But in general, do you think there is a point to revisiting a season that has gone by and trying to understand how you can improve your model? Or do you think that because the outcome is not necessarily correlated as much anyway, do you think that it's just a case of you making sure that you're using the right inputs?
Yeah, so personally for me, any work that I've done in that sense has come from, I would say, a very humble perspective, in the sense that, I think a lot of people misunderstand that I don't come from a maths background, really. So when I played my first season, I was getting into models during that first season, and I don't think I actually built my first model until my second season. And I don't really think I'm very good at it. And I've never said that any of my models are good. I've just always done them as decision support tools that, as I said, it's nice to know that you have the inputs. So for me personally, a lot of the revisiting has been kind of revisiting and touching up on things within the actual terrible model that I've made myself. So, i.e., perhaps trying to improve the way that team strength might inform some things, that kind of thing, and rather than trying to do sort of more like tests about whether it's actually sort of good or not. Because my goal with building it was never to try and get a model that was going to be better than something like Review. I think he's got that. I think he's got that covered. I'm not going to waste my time trying to get there. It was more about that kind of learning endeavor in that sense. But perhaps more relevant from me than what you said is when I built the models for lineup prediction for Man City and that kind of thing. And when you do skill weighting in that sense, those are incredibly important to do retrospective work to work out what is predictive and what is not. But as we said, the feedback loop is so distorted in FPL generally that it's an incredible amount of work if you do start to do that.
I see. And also, an example that I always think back to is, you and I built our separate Euro 2020 models. And I remember asking the general Twitter populace a question along the lines of, what do people use as home advantage, right? So, and I kind of aggregated the XG of the top five leagues, home and away. And you can see that when crowds are present, because you have to discount the COVID seasons, you can clearly see that there is a distinct difference between accumulation of xg at home and accumulation of xg away from home. So, as you said, that even if you don't if you are not 100% confident on the outcome of your model, I think there are some things that you can understand that you previously might not have had a good grasp on, and maybe you can use that level of understanding and apply it to something like review when you're making your picks, or maybe choosing who you want to captain. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I would say that's a fair assumption. I think just as I said, for me at least, the difficulty of a lot of the evaluation side of it does just come from how messy these things are and the feedback loop and things like that. So, I mean, I think probably on this topic, like I said, the work I did on the hivemind lineups and the associated skill weightings is probably a good small thing to talk about on this kind of topic, because like there's a couple of people I think now that do and post hivemind lineups where they ask fans and people in the know to submit their lineups, and then you'll derive the percentage likelihood of a start from that kind of thing, and that's all well and good, and that performs better than a single person on average. But with something that is so absolute like that, where you can just submit a single person yes or no to start, and then you get evaluated on that. I mean, for me at least, what I realized very, very quickly, which is why the skill weighting for these kind of things is so important, is that you pick up so much noise and so much incorrect information that makes skillful decisions look like mistakes and make mistakes look like skillful decisions. And that's why I mean, I did it for I think the first 9 game weeks this season. My 2.0 skill weighting of the Man City auto generated model I have for the lineups, but the actual evaluation process of that is so time consuming, which is why I stopped. Because if you have someone that predicts 11 players, to reward them for their accuracy, you actually do kind of need to go way beyond sort of the actual 11 that they've picked in a lot of ways, because as we said, there's so much noise and just general variance in football, and then also in lineups in general. So when you make a lineup prediction and you say something like, oh, 10 out of 11 I got, yeah, it seems very good, but actually it doesn't really, at least for me, I found it doesn't inform anything reliably about whether the prediction was good or not, because there's things you don't know. Players are being benched for reasons that frankly you have no idea why they're being benched. They just might be benched because they woke up feeling sick and you felt like they were going to be rotated for tactical reasons, and actually the outcome is completely correct. You've got the 10 out of 11, one of which is this player you thought would be benched, but you thought he would be benched for tactical reasons, and actually you have no idea that he was benched for the fact that he woke up with a bit of a stomach ache. And in a skill weighting model, you might get these good beats, you might get these bad beats over and over, and it looks like you're a good predictor or a bad predictor, but actually putting in the time retroactively to then go back and evaluate sort of the manner in which the prediction was made and the manner in which the outcomes happened, to then fairly attribute skill weighting, and that is incredibly time consuming, that process. So I mean, personally, I've never really got into that with my own models, but it's incredibly important if you want to take this seriously. And this is the kind of thing that review does, and I'm pretty sure Kiwi and other people do. But like I said, I did it with my lineup prediction model, but it took way too much of my time. I just couldn't maintain it anymore.
Yeah, I love what you talked about in terms of revisiting decision making and how important that is, because it probably also has a large impact on the discussion that we'll have on skill versus luck in FPL later on. But just to switch gears, I wanted to know your thoughts on ensemble models, because we do have a few models in FPL, FPL Reviews, FPL Kiwis, Mikhail Tokvams, amongst others. What do you feel about the application of ensemble models within FPL? And do you think it's helpful, for example, that some people would use ensemble models to, let's say, hedge against people who, let's say, play alongside a certain line, such as FPL reviews model, for example? And do you think that that actually has good applications in FPL?
Yeah, well, I mean, the great book, The Wisdom of the Crowds, it's a fantastic book that everyone should read, and is why we do these kind of hive mind lineups and things, because aggregating the judgment and the opinion of many different people, generally almost always, or very consistently at least, beats accuracy of the average member of that same group of predictors. So it's always a good place to start ensembling, crowdsourcing anything. I think personally, when we start talking about crowdsourcing FPL models, I think you need to be careful because there's very few available. So I would argue that you probably don't have enough to get that nice wisdom of a crowd hive mind effect that you would usually get elsewhere. And when you don't have enough like that, you really need to be careful about what goes into a hive mind judgment. Because as with anything, cooking, making anything, bad stuff goes in, bad stuff comes out. So I think, at least for me, looking at two models that you respect and looking at bookies odds, that gets you there. I'm not sure generally in the current market or in the current environment, adding much more to that is going to get you to a more predictive place, personally.
Before we move on, I actually had a question about your xMin model, because I think that's one of the more interesting and niche areas of FPL. And you also spoke about the hive mind, where if 10 out of, let's say, 20 people predict a player to start, it's not the same as that player having a 50% having 50% x minutes of 90, is it? So without maybe going into too much details, like how did you kind of differentiate between the hive mind stuff that is being published right now for, I think, the top 6 clubs, where they just look at how many percentage of the crowd expects that player to start, against how many minutes are they expected to play, which is basically comparing a binary variable to a continuous variable. So how do you kind of tackle that thing in your model?
Yeah, that's getting pretty heavy. For me, at least. So again, coming back to, as I said, it's always nice if we can come back to percentages. You have to go about things in obviously a slightly different way. Again, you have to ask yourself the question, what is it you're actually doing this thing for? And actually the purpose of why you might generate something to predict lineups and why you might generate something to predict X minutes is completely different. One's predicting the start and one's predicting minutes. So actually the inputs and the percentages of things you need to look at are slightly different. So obviously when you look at X minutes, you start to, you might actually take that initial likelihood to start percentage, but that doesn't get you all the way there in terms of predicting the X minutes. You then need some other percentages, like, for example, if they don't start, then what do you think the percentage likelihood is that they sub on? And if they do start, what's the percentage likelihood that they get subbed off? And then within those two things, you kind of have another layer of like, okay, well, what's the percentage likelihood that it happens in kind of this small range of minutes, that range of minutes, for both they come on, they come off. So it's much more layered in that sense, and it gets very complicated. And then again, in terms of, like I said, once you get into that territory, in terms of making sure that it's being done well and you're happy with the predictive power, again, you then need to kind of like start going back and looking at certain things and reasons, and game state's a massive thing as well. Of even with something granular like xMins, you can't pretend that just because you're getting that roughly right, it's looking good. So you can guess 60 minutes for Haaland or someone that you think is going to have minutes managed generally, definitely. So you basically think 100% going to start, but they're going to have their minutes managed. So it's going to be around the hour mark. They're subbed off because of fitness reasons, and that's kind of like your basis for making that kind of prediction of 60 minutes. But actually, in reality, if the game's 5-0 and they're an important player, 5-0 by 60 minutes, they're going to get taken off. And the question you ask is like, well, is that right? Is that wrong? Were you right in that prediction? Well, actually, taking Haaland as an example, I think people generally in the first 8 game weeks were very surprised by the fact that when City were 0-0, Haaland was staying on until like the 90th minute, essentially, because we were all expecting minutes to be managed. So, like with what I just said, in another world where that team is not winning 5-0, that player stays on until 90, but you just happen to get the 5-0 output and get the 60 right.
So if we kind of look at it, and I appreciate the fact that you can't go into a lot of details, but essentially it's at its core, if you want to kind of really thread the needle, you would say that you would consider some things like game state as well, which is like really getting into the nitty gritty of it. But ultimately, if you want to make it a more accurate model of prediction, that is where you would ultimately end up going. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. With, like I said, with whether it be lineups or X minutes, or again, I think is really important for everyone listening as well that things aren't overcomplicated as well. Even normal decisions that aren't model-based decisions. Like you need to evaluate your process and do kind of I talk about percentages a lot. In my opinion, I think if anyone wants to get better at FPL, the best thing that they could do is read the book Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. It's a fantastic book. It's one of the best books I've ever read. And, she talks about this idea of a post-mortem for all of your decisions, which is basically that when you make a decision and it's done and the outcome's done, you basically sort of need to go back and have a look at your decision and things like that. She's also got another book called How to Decide, which is kind of more practical about just generally how to make good decisions. But ultimately, with all these things, if you have a specific reason for making a decision, or have a specific reason or basis for some kind of inputs, you need to make sure that the outcome has sort of come as a result of them, and you're sort of being very fair and honest with yourself in that kind of evaluation. As I said, it's even if you make the decision to, if you've got 2 job offers, you've got job offer A, you've got job offer B, and you think that one of them might earn you more money in the longer term, and because of the career progression, because of a certain skill that they might teach you that the other job can't, and you take that job, and then maybe something crazy happens after 2 years, like maybe 2 people in your team leave the company at the same time or something, and you get like promoted and fast-tracked way earlier than ever would be expected because of a really unique circumstance, and that causes you to earn more money. You might want to sit there and say, yeah, I was right, choosing this job has earned me more money in the long term, but actually it's happened because of something that was completely irrelevant and unrelated and unforeseeable in relation to your original decision and the state you're in at that time.
Well, that was an insightful half hour indeed. We hope you have a better grasp on data modeling in FPL, and stay tuned for part 2 of our interview with Elevenify, where we talk about one of the most common debates in FPL, luck versus skill. But is that even the right way to frame the debate?